It was just after dawn on December 23rd, 1944, a morning defined by a biting, relentless cold that seeped through steel and wool alike. Near the small, snow-dusted village of Hotten in Belgium, a German tank commander stood in the cupola of his machine, scanning the horizon. He felt something deeply wrong, a primal instinct pricking at the back of his neck, yet he could not explain it. The road ahead was quiet, almost peaceful, with heavy frost clinging to the pine trees and a thin, spectral fog hanging low over the rolling Ardennes hills. Beneath him, his King Tiger, a mechanical leviathan weighing nearly 70 tons, sat like a steel fortress, its massive engine idled with a deep, rhythmic thrum that vibrated through the soles of his boots. The 88mm KWK-43 gun, a weapon of terrifying precision and power, pointed forward, confident and seemingly unstoppable. For months, the German propaganda machine and their own combat experiences had reinforced a singular, dangerous truth. The Americans had nothing that could reliably stop a King Tiger at long range. The frontal armor of this beast was thick enough to shrug off Allied shells like hail off a tin roof. This technological superiority bred a dangerous arrogance. The crews believed they were the apex predators of the European theater. And yet, somewhere beyond that veil of white fog, an unseen threat was already lining up its shot, calculating windage and elevation with a patience that defied the chaos of war. If you want more content like this, subscribe now and comment below. At that exact moment, less than 2 miles away, a distance previously considered safe by German standards, a group of American tank destroyer crewmen crouched inside a vehicle that was the antithesis of the German heavy tanks. It was a thin-skinned machine that looked nothing like the steel monsters approaching them. It had no turret roof, leaving the crew exposed to the biting wind and the terrifying prospect of airburst artillery. It possessed no thick armor to deflect incoming fire. A heavy machine gun could chew through its side plating. Most German officers had never even heard its name, and those who had dismissed it as a stopgap measure. It was the M36 Jackson. However, mounted inside its open turret was a weapon that changed the calculus of the battlefield entirely. A long-barreled 90mm gun. This was a piece of ordnance that few enemy commanders believed existed in the American arsenal. The men inside the Jackson knew the truth of their situation intimately. They understood that they were participating in a deadly game of shoot and scoot. They knew that their survival depended entirely on the element of surprise. If they were spotted first, they would not survive long enough to fire a second round. They were hunters made of glass, carrying a sledgehammer. The M36 Jackson had entered combat quietly in late 1944, slipping into the theater almost unnoticed amid the chaos of collapsing fronts and desperate German counterattacks. It was not a glamorous machine, nor did it inspire confidence at first glance. To the infantryman walking beside it, it looked vulnerable. Its armor was so thin that even a near miss from high explosive ordnance could wound the crew with flying fragments. The open turret meant that snow, freezing rain, and, more fatally, shrapnel could fall directly inside the fighting compartment. But the gun changed everything. The 90mm M3 cannon was the same weapon system used on the Pershing heavy tank, a gun capable of generating muzzle velocities that turned solid steel shot into a kinetic thunderbolt. It was capable of punching through German armor at distances that shocked even American commanders when they first saw the test results at the Aberdeen Proving Ground. But test ranges are not battlefields, and the crew of the M36 had to prove that this physics equation held true in the muddy, freezing reality of the Ardennes. By the winter of 1944, American forces in Europe had learned painful, bloody lessons about the superiority of German armor. The standard M4 Shermans, the workhorses of the Allied advance, had struggled desperately against the Panthers and Tigers since the landings in Normandy. Tank crews knew the distinctive, cracking sound of German high-velocity guns, and they feared them. A Panther could destroy a Sherman from across a valley before the American crew even realized they were under fire. The King Tiger, introduced in smaller numbers but wielding immense psychological power, was even worse. Its frontal armor was nearly immune to most Allied guns, including the 76mm guns of the upgraded Shermans. This technological disparity created a Tiger panic among the ranks. German crews felt untouchable, enclosed in a bubble of invincibility. Many believed they were gods of war beyond 500 yards, safe to pick off targets at their leisure. That belief, forged in the hedgerows of France, would soon be shattered in the snows of Belgium. The psychological shift that was about to occur would be as devastating as the kinetic impact of the shells themselves. The M36 was rushed into service because Allied commanders were desperate. Intelligence reports from France and the brutal fighting in the Hurtgen forest made it clear that existing tank destroyers, the M10 Wolverine and the M18 Hellcat, could not reliably defeat heavy German armor at combat ranges. The M10 and M18 were fast, agile, and aggressive, but their guns lacked the raw stopping power needed against the latest German designs. They had to flank the enemy, a dangerous and often impossible maneuver in restricted terrain. Engineers, working against the clock, took the proven, reliable chassis of the M10 and fitted it with the massive 90mm gun. There was little time for refinement or creature comforts. The turret had to be open-topped to save weight and allow the gun to be worked, but it also required a massive counterweight at the rear to balance the long barrel. Crews trained quickly, often learning the nuances of their new weapon on the move, reading manuals by flashlight as they rumbled toward the front. They were learning to operate a giant killer just as the Germans prepared their last, greatest offensive in the West. When the German attack began on December 16th, 1944, the Ardennes exploded into absolute chaos. The Ghost Front, previously a quiet sector for resting troops, became the epicenter of the war. Snow-covered roads filled with retreating American units, their vehicles sliding on ice, their morale battered. Communication lines broke down under sabotage and shelling. German armor pushed forward under the cover of heavy fog and poor weather, which grounded the superior Allied Air Force exactly as their planners intended. King Tigers rolled through sleepy villages, their tracks crushing roadblocks and scattering infantry who had no anti-tank weapons capable of scratching them. Many American soldiers, seeing these behemoths emerge from the mist, believed nothing could stop them. Panic began to spread, but scattered among the crumbling defensive lines were small, isolated groups of M36 Jacksons. They were waiting quietly, using the dense terrain, their patience, and their extreme range as their primary weapons. They were the last line of defense against an iron tide. One of those crews belonged to the 703rd Tank Destroyer Battalion, positioned strategically near the freezing waters of the Ourthe River. Their orders were simple in words, but terrifying in implication. Hold the line. Delay the German advance at any cost to buy time for reinforcements. Sergeant William McLean, a hardened veteran of earlier fighting in France, commanded one of the M36s. He was a realist. He knew his vehicle could not trade shots with a King Tiger in a close-quarters brawl. The German reload speed and armor would win every time. The Jackson's strength was distance. It was a sniper rifle on tracks. If they could see the enemy first, and if the range was right, the 90mm could do what no Sherman gun could reliably accomplish. But the tension inside the open turret was palpable. The cold air bit at their faces, and every snapping twig sounded like an approaching enemy. As the fog lifted slightly that morning, revealing the stark black and white landscape, McLean's gunner spotted movement on a distant ridgeline. Through his high magnification binoculars, the unmistakable, angular shape of a King Tiger emerged. It was a terrifying sight, the massive turret slowly scanning the valley, hunting for prey. The range was extreme, nearly 2,800 yards by their estimate, over 1.5 miles. Under normal circumstances, with a standard tank gun, firing at that distance would have been considered pointless, a waste of ammunition that would only reveal their position. But the 90mm gun changed the rules of engagement. The crew worked silently, a choreographed dance of death. The loader shoved the heavy shell into the breech. The gunner adjusted his hand wheels, compensating for the drop of the shell over such a vast distance. Each man was focused, knowing that one mistake, one miscalculation, would end them all. The German optics were excellent. If the Tiger turned, they were dead. The first shot cracked through the cold air, a sharp, flat sound unlike the deeper, thunderous boom of German guns. The high-velocity round flew for several seconds, a tracer burning a red hole through the gray sky. It struck the King Tiger's turret. At first, from that distance, nothing seemed to happen. Then, a puff of smoke poured from the impact point. The German tank stopped abruptly, its turret freezing in place mid-rotation. Inside that steel beast, the crew had been hit by something they never expected, physics they didn't believe applied to them. A penetration at that range was supposed to be mathematically impossible, according to their briefings. Within moments, Flames burst from the engine deck as the internal ammunition or fuel ignited. The King Tiger, the invincible monarch of the battlefield, was dead. Further down the line, another German tank commander watched in utter disbelief as his lead vehicle burned. He ordered his crew to scan frantically for enemy tanks, expecting Shermans or tank destroyers closer than a mile away. His doctrine told him the enemy must be close. What he did not expect, what he could not comprehend, was death from beyond visual certainty. Before he could react or issue a fire command, another 90mm round slammed into his hull. This one did not penetrate fully, but the kinetic energy was so massive that it spalled the interior armor, sending razor-sharp metal fragments flying inside the tank. It shocked the crew and forced them to halt. The psychological impact was immediate and devastating. The sense of invulnerability that had fueled their advance vanished in a heartbeat. German reports from that week showed genuine confusion and frustration. Crews described being engaged from extreme distances by an unknown American weapon. Some believed it was a new heavy tank class. Others, grasping for logic, thought it might be naval guns firing from hidden positions miles away. The truth was simpler and more humiliating. Thin-skinned American tank destroyers, essentially open buckets of bolts, were killing the most feared tanks in Europe without ever coming into close combat. However, the M-36 crews paid a steep price for every success. They were fighting a war of nerves. When German artillery found their positions, the open turrets became deadly traps. There was no roof to protect them from airbursts. Shrapnel tore through exposed crewmen, and the concussive force of nearby explosions could incapacitate a crew without a direct hit. Machine gun fire forced commanders to keep their heads down, blinding the vehicle. But the gun kept firing. They had to. Each destroyed German tank bought precious time for the disorganized Allied armies to regroup. Roads clogged with burning wrecks, supply columns stalled behind them. The precise German timetable, essential for their blitzkrieg strategy, slipped hour by hour, mile by mile. By December 24th, near the village of Mannheim, the strategic value of the M36 became undeniable. Another M36 unit ambushed a column of German armor moving along a narrow road bordered by frozen fields. The Americans had prepared the battlefield, pre-measuring ranges to specific landmarks: a lone tree, a farmhouse, a fence post. When the Germans crossed these invisible lines, the Jacksons opened fire from nearly 3,000 yards. It was a turkey shoot. One King Tiger after another was hit. Some were disabled by track hits, others destroyed outright by catastrophic ammunition fires. German infantry scattered into the snow, unsure where the fire was coming from, paralyzed by the lack of a visible enemy. The road became a graveyard of steel. Word spread quickly among American units. The M36 was no longer an unknown quantity. Crews whispered about its power, its reach, and its danger. Commanders began placing them on high ground behind ridges, covering long approaches, utilizing them not as tanks, but as long-range snipers. The Jackson became a phantom. Its role was clear: kill the enemy before he knows you are there. For the Germans, the shock was profound and doctrinal. Their entire method of warfare relied on armor superiority and psychological dominance to break the enemy's will. When that dominance failed, when their invincible tanks began burning at 2,000 yards, morale cracked. Tank commanders grew cautious, halting to scan every ridge. Advances slowed to a crawl. Requests for reconnaissance increased, clogging the radio networks. The fear that had once belonged exclusively to American crews now crept into German minds. Somewhere out there, hidden in the tree line, was a gun that could reach out and kill them from beyond their own effective range. As Christmas Eve approached, the snow deepened, and the fighting intensified to a fever pitch. The Battle of the Bulge was reaching its most desperate phase. German fuel shortages worsened, exacerbating their tactical failures. Allied air power waited for clear skies to unleash hell. And hidden among the forests and hills, the M36 Jacksons continued their deadly work, rewriting the rules of armored warfare, one long-range shot at a time. What the Germans still did not fully understand was that this was only the beginning. The 90mm gun had more surprises to deliver, specifically the scarcity but high effectiveness of high-velocity armor-piercing HVAP rounds. The M36 crews were growing more confident with every engagement, their initial fear replaced by a cold, professional grimness. The myth of the invincible King Tiger was dying in the cold Ardennes air. and it was being killed by a weapon most German commanders never knew they had to fear. By Christmas morning, December 25th, 1944, the Ardennes no longer felt like a surprise battlefield where the Germans held the initiative. It felt like a slow, grinding test of nerves. Snow fell steadily, muffling sound and hiding movement, creating a surreal, claustrophobic atmosphere. German columns were still pushing west, but the speed was gone. Every open road now felt dangerous. Every ridgeline felt watched. Somewhere out there, American guns were waiting, and German tank crews no longer trusted distance to keep them safe. Near the besieged town of Bastogne, elements of the 814th Tank Destroyer Battalion were repositioning their M36 Jacksons under orders issued just after midnight. The message was brief, urgent, and terrifying. German heavy armor had been spotted moving toward key crossroads south of the town. The Americans did not have many tanks to spare, and the paratroopers and infantry units were exhausted, low on ammunition, and freezing. Once again, the burden of stopping the heavy armor would fall on a few thin-skinned vehicles with very long guns. Lieutenant Charles Weaver, barely 24 years old but aged decades by the war, commanded a section of 2 M36s overlooking a frozen valley near the village of Sibret. Weaver had studied the terrain carefully, thinking like a hunter. He chose firing positions that allowed long sight lines but offered quick escape routes into the heavy woods. His crews dug in, using snow and brush to break up the sharp, manufactured outlines of their vehicles. They knew the drill by now. Fire first, fire far, move immediately. To stay still was to die. Just after 10 a.m., the German armor appeared, dark shapes against the white snow. 2 King Tigers and several Panthers moved cautiously along the valley floor, infantry riding on their decks huddled against the cold. The Germans were alert now. Their turrets scanned constantly, looking for the telltale muzzle flash of anti-tank guns. But even alert crews could not see what they did not expect to be there. The range was extreme, just over 2,700 yards. Weaver hesitated only a moment to confirm the targets. He gave the signal. The first 90mm round struck the lead King Tiger just below the turret ring, a critical weak point. The penetration was partial, but the impact was catastrophic. It jammed the turret mechanism and wounded the gunner inside with spalling metal. The second shot came seconds later, this time piercing the thinner side armor as the tank began to turn in panic. Flames erupted almost instantly, violent and consuming. German infantry leaped from the decks and ran for cover, slipping on the ice as machine gun fire stitched the snow around them. The second King Tiger tried to reverse, its engine roaring and tracks churning up frozen mud, but it was too slow. Another 90mm round slammed into the rear armor, penetrating the engine block. This time, the penetration was complete. The tank shuddered violently and stopped. Thick, black smoke poured out, followed by an oil fire that lit up the gray morning. The Panthers, seeing their heavy support obliterated, scattered, firing blindly toward the ridgeline. Their shells fell short or exploded harmlessly in the trees. The M36s had already moved, their engines roaring as they disappeared behind the hill before German gunners could adjust their aim. Encounters like this repeated across the bulge. The M36 Jackson did not fight often. It wasn't designed for brawling, but when it did, the results were decisive. German after-action reports from late December describe heavy losses to long-range American fire that could not be accurately traced. The confusion was total. Some commanders believed the Americans had deployed a new heavy tank in secret. Others suspected fixed anti-tank guns of unusually large caliber. Very few correctly identified the M36, and fewer still understood how vulnerable their prized heavy tanks had become to this specific threat. The key to this lethality was ammunition. By late 1944, American industry had solved a critical problem. New armor-piercing rounds for the 90mm gun, including the scarce HVAP high-velocity armor-piercing ammunition, could punch through even the thick armor of a King Tiger under the right conditions. These rounds were made with a tungsten core and were incredibly fast. They were scarce, and crews were ordered to save them for the heaviest targets. When used properly, they turned the M36 into a true tank killer, capable of negating the German armor advantage entirely. On December 30th, near the town of Marche, an M36 from the 702nd Tank Destroyer Battalion recorded one of the longest confirmed kills of the war, a shot that bordered on the miraculous. Using a ridge as cover and firing downhill, a difficult angle for any gunner, the crew engaged a stationary King Tiger at just under 3,000 yards. The first round struck the mantlet and failed to penetrate, ricocheting off into the sky. The second hit lower, exploiting a weak angle on the hull. The third round broke through the side armor as the German tank attempted to maneuver. The German tank burned for hours, a funeral pyre visible for miles, a testament to the reach of the 90mm gun. By New Year's Day 1945, the momentum of the entire campaign had shifted. The skies cleared, and Allied aircraft returned to punish the exposed German columns. Fuel shortages crippled German movement, leaving massive tanks stranded like beached whales. Roads littered with destroyed vehicles slowed every advance. And behind many of those wrecks was the quiet, lethal work of M36 crews who rarely received attention at the time. They did not charge forward in glory. They did not duel at close range like the knights of old. They waited, watched, and struck from a distance the enemy thought was safe. The psychological effect on German crews was severe and paralyzing. King Tiger commanders, once aggressive and dominating, now hesitated before moving into open ground. Requests for infantry screens to scout ahead increased, slowing progress further. In armored warfare, hesitation is often fatal. The Germans could not afford it anymore, yet the M36 forced them to pause. American infantry units noticed the change immediately. Where heavy tanks had once rolled forward confidently, terrifying the dug-in GIs, they now stopped, probed, and often withdrew. Rather than face the invisible fire, morale improved significantly. Soldiers who had felt helpless against German armor now believed the enemy could be beaten. The M36 did more than destroy tanks. It restored confidence at a critical moment when the Allied line was bending to its breaking point. Despite its success, the M36 remained a dangerous vehicle for its crew. It was a glass cannon in the truest sense. German artillery and mortars took a steady toll. Open turrets offered little protection against airbursts, and the crews lived in constant fear of a lucky mortar round dropping right into their lap. Winter exposure caused frostbite, trench foot, and exhaustion. Crews slept in their vehicles, ate cold rations, and stayed alert for days at a time, their eyes straining against the snow glare. But they knew their role mattered. Every long-range kill saved lives closer to the front. Every burning Tiger was a victory for the infantrymen shivering in their foxholes. As January wore on, the German offensive collapsed completely. The Battle of the Bulge ended not with a dramatic surrender, but with a slow, agonizing retreat back to the German border. Destroyed tanks were abandoned where they stood. Fuel tanks were empty, engines silent. Among them were dozens of King Tigers, many knocked out by guns the Germans never believed could reach them. In the months that followed, the M36 Jackson continued to serve across Europe. It supported advances into Germany, covering open ground and guarding flanks. Its reputation grew among American units, even if it never became famous in the public eye like the Sherman or the Tiger. Tank destroyer crews knew what they had accomplished. They had faced the most feared armored vehicle of the war, a machine built to rule the battlefield, and beaten it on their own terms. After the war, historians would debate exact ranges and specific engagements. Some claims would be questioned, analyzed, and reevaluated. Others would be confirmed by matching American logs with German loss reports. But the broader truth remained unchanged. The M36 Jackson, armed with its potent 90mm gun, shattered a dangerous myth. It proved that heavy armor was not invincible. It proved that distance was no longer a guarantee of safety. And in the frozen forests of the Ardennes, a quiet American weapon helped decide the fate of an entire campaign. The Germans never truly understood what hit them until it was too late. And for the crews of the M36, shivering in their open turrets, watching the smoke rise from distant wrecks, that was exactly how it had to be.